Picture this. A high-ranking military officer walks into a room full of seasoned veterans and within minutes becomes the target of ridicule and mockery. Day after day, the harassment continues. Colleagues snicker behind her back, question her competence, and treat her like an outsider who doesn't belong. But what if I told you that the person being mocked held a rank so high that even the colonel doing the mocking should have been standing at attention? What if the very person they dismissed as unworthy was actually their superior in ways they never imagined? This is the true story of how assumptions, prejudice, and military ego created one of the most embarrassing situations in recent naval history. It's a story about respect, recognition, and the moment when reality comes crashing down like a tidal wave. The truth? Sometimes the person you underestimate the most is the one who holds your entire career in their hands. Welcome to a story where ranks were ignored, respect was forgotten, and one colonel learned the hardest lesson of his military career. Admiral Sarah Mitchell had seen many challenging situations in her 28 years of naval service, but walking into the Joint Military Conference Room at Norfolk Naval Base on that humid Monday morning in September felt different. The room buzzed with the familiar energy of military personnel preparing for what promised to be an intensive week-long strategic planning session. Officers from various branches mingled, their uniforms creating a colorful tapestry of military hierarchy and tradition. Sarah wore her Navy service dress blues, the uniform regulation required for such formal occasions. However, due to a last-minute uniform cleaning mishap at the dry cleaners, her rank insignia had been temporarily misplaced. The base uniform supply office had provided her with temporary lieutenant commander bars until her proper admiral stars could be replaced. It was a minor inconvenience that she expected to resolve within a day or two. As she entered the room, Sarah noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere that often occurred when someone new joined a group of military personnel. Eyes assessed, ranks were noted, and social hierarchies began to form. She approached the registration table, where a young ensign handed her a name tag that simply read, S. Mitchell, without any rank designation. Another administrative oversight that would prove significant in the days to come. Colonel James Hartford was already holding court near the coffee station, regaling a small group of officers with stories from his recent deployment in Eastern Europe. At 52 years old, Hartford had built a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense infantry officer who demanded respect and gave little quarter to those he deemed unworthy of his attention. His chest displayed an impressive array of ribbons and commendations, and his bearing commanded immediate attention from junior officers. When Hartford first noticed Sarah, his eyes immediately went to her rank insignia. Lieutenant Commander, he noted mentally. Probably some desk jockey from the Pentagon sent to observe real military planning. He had little patience for what he considered administrative types who had never seen real combat or made life-and-death decisions in the field. His initial assessment was swift and dismissive. The first interaction came during the opening briefing session. As officers took their seats according to an informal hierarchy based on rank and experience, Sarah found herself directed to a seat toward the back of the room, among other mid-level officers. She said nothing, understanding that her temporary situation created confusion about her actual position in the military hierarchy. During the coffee break that followed the opening presentations, Hartford approached the group where Sarah was standing. The conversation had turned to recent naval operations in the Mediterranean, a topic about which Sarah had extensive first-hand knowledge, having recently completed a tour as the commanding officer of a carrier strike group in that exact region. When Sarah began to contribute to the discussion, sharing insights about the challenges of coordinating multinational naval exercises, Hartford interrupted her with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice carrying across the immediate area, "I think the adults are talking about real military operations here. Maybe you should focus on whatever administrative duties brought you to this conference." The conversation stopped. Other officers looked uncomfortable, sensing the tension but unsure how to respond. Sarah remained calm, her expression neutral. "I was simply sharing some observations from recent operations in that theater," she replied quietly. Hartford's response was louder, designed to be overheard by nearby groups. "Operations? What operations would a lieutenant commander have been involved in? Filing reports about operations, maybe." Several officers chuckled nervously, uncertain whether Hartford's behavior was appropriate, but unwilling to challenge a full colonel. This exchange set the tone for what would follow over the next several days. Hartford had marked Sarah as someone he could safely dismiss and even ridicule, someone whose rank gave her no power to challenge his behavior. In his mind, he was dealing with a mid-level administrative officer who had somehow found herself in a conference designed for serious military strategists and combat leaders. The second day brought more of the same treatment, but with increasing boldness from Hartford. During a working lunch session focused on joint service cooperation, Sarah offered a suggestion about improving communication protocols between naval and ground forces during amphibious operations. Her suggestion was based on extensive experience coordinating exactly such operations during her time as a Rear Admiral lower half, but Hartford saw it differently. "Listen, Lieutenant Commander," Hartford said, setting down his sandwich with exaggerated emphasis. "Naval officers who've never set foot on a real battlefield shouldn't be giving advice about ground operations. Why don't you stick to whatever it is you actually do in the Navy? Probably something with computers or paperwork." The comment stung not just because of its dismissive tone, but because of the fundamental ignorance it revealed about Sarah's actual background. She had, in fact, served multiple combat tours, had been awarded the Bronze Star for her actions during a rescue operation, and had commanded vessels in some of the most dangerous waters in the world. But wearing Lieutenant Commander bars and sitting among mid-level officers, she appeared to be exactly what Hartford assumed she was. Other officers began to follow Hartford's lead, perhaps sensing that aligning themselves with his obvious disdain for Sarah was the politically safe choice. Comments became more frequent and more pointed. When Sarah suggested modifications to a logistics protocol during a working group session, a major from Hartford's unit openly laughed and said, "The lieutenant commander thinks she knows better than officers who've actually been in the field." By the third day, the situation had escalated beyond simple professional dismissal. Hartford began making personal comments about Sarah's appearance, her speaking style, and her presence at the conference. During a break between sessions, he loudly proclaimed to a group that included several junior officers, "I don't know who decided that lieutenant commanders needed to attend strategic planning conferences, but it's clear some people are here who don't belong." Sarah endured each incident with remarkable composure, understanding that revealing her true rank at this point might seem defensive or create unnecessary drama. She had initially expected the uniform situation to be resolved quickly, but bureaucratic delays at the supply office meant her proper insignia remained unavailable. Each day that passed made the revelation of her true identity more complex and potentially embarrassing for everyone involved. The conference sessions themselves were fascinating and productive, despite the social tensions. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by much of the strategic thinking on display, and was able to contribute valuable insights, even while being dismissed by Hartford and his growing circle of supporters. Her suggestions were often quietly adopted by working groups, even if her verbal contributions were publicly dismissed. On the evening of the third day, during an informal gathering at the officers' club, Hartford's behavior reached new levels of inappropriateness. After several drinks, he began telling stories that portrayed naval officers as pampered and out of touch with real military service. "Take our lieutenant commander here," he said, gesturing towards Sarah with his drink. "Probably never spent a night sleeping in the mud or wondering if she'd see another sunrise. But here she is, trying to tell real soldiers how to do their jobs." Sarah excused herself early that evening, understanding that Hartford's alcohol consumption was making an already difficult situation potentially explosive. She returned to her temporary quarters and placed a call to her aide, instructing him to expedite the delivery of her proper uniform items, even if it meant having them flown in from another base. The fourth day brought a new dynamic to the situation. Word had begun to spread among some of the naval officers present that something was not quite right about Sarah's situation. A few had begun to suspect that she might be more than she appeared, based on her extensive knowledge and the way she carried herself. However, Hartford remained oblivious to these undercurrents, continuing his pattern of public dismissal and private mockery. During a presentation about future naval aviation requirements, Sarah offered detailed insights about carrier operations that demonstrated knowledge no lieutenant commander should possess. When questioned about the source of her information, she simply stated that she had worked closely with carrier operations in her previous assignments. Hartford seized on this vague response as evidence that she was inflating her own importance. "Working closely with carrier operations," Hartford repeated mockingly to the room. That could mean anything from serving coffee to the real officers to filing reports about operations she never actually participated in. "This is exactly what I've been talking about. People pretending to have experience they don't actually have." The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Several officers had begun to recognize that Hartford's behavior was becoming increasingly inappropriate, regardless of Sarah's actual rank. Military courtesy demanded a certain level of professional respect between officers, even across rank differences, and Hartford was clearly violating those standards. That evening, Sarah's aide arrived at the base with her proper uniform items, including her Admiral stars and the appropriate ribbons and decorations that reflected her true rank and experience. As she prepared her uniform for the next day, Sarah reflected on the week's events and the lessons they had provided about assumptions, respect, and the nature of military hierarchy. The stage was now set for a revelation that would transform not just Hartford's understanding of the situation, but the entire dynamic of the conference. Sarah understood that the moment of truth was approaching, and she prepared herself for the conversations that would inevitably follow. The question was no longer whether her true identity would be revealed, but how Hartford and others would respond when they learned exactly who they had been dismissing and ridiculing for the past 4 days. As she hung up her proper uniform, complete with the 4 stars that marked her as a full admiral, Sarah couldn't help but reflect on the broader implications of what had transpired. The military prided itself on merit-based respect and professional courtesy, yet she had witnessed how quickly those principles could be abandoned when assumptions about rank and status clouded judgment. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning that would challenge everyone present to examine their own biases and preconceptions about leadership, respect, and the true nature of military professionalism. The 5th morning of the conference dawned crisp and clear, with autumn beginning to make its presence felt at Norfolk Naval Base. Admiral Sarah Mitchell stood before her mirror, carefully adjusting the 4 stars on her shoulder boards and ensuring that every ribbon and decoration was perfectly aligned. After 4 days of enduring mockery and dismissal while wearing incorrect rank insignia, she was finally able to present herself in her proper uniform. Her aide, Lieutenant Commander Peterson, had delivered not just her uniform items, but also a folder containing her official orders for the conference, clearly identifying her as the senior naval representative and co-chair of the Strategic Planning Committee. The irony was not lost on her that she had spent 4 days being treated as an unwelcome observer at a conference she was technically helping to lead. As she walked toward the conference building, other early arriving officers began to notice her approach. The transformation was striking, not just because of the change in uniform, but because of the way Sarah carried herself when no longer constrained by the need to downplay her actual authority. Her bearing was unmistakably that of a senior flag officer, someone accustomed to command and respect. Commander Williams, a naval intelligence officer who had suspected something was amiss about Sarah's situation, was among the first to see her that morning. His eyes widened as he took in the 4 stars, and he immediately came to attention and rendered a sharp salute. "Admiral Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of respect and amazement. "It's an honor to serve with you, ma'am." Officers who had witnessed Hartford's behavior over the past 4 days suddenly understood the magnitude of what they had observed. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as personnel processed the implications of what they were learning. The lieutenant commander who had been dismissed and ridiculed was actually one of the highest-ranking officers present at the entire conference. Hartford arrived at his usual time, carrying his coffee and chatting casually with his aide about the day's scheduled presentations. He had developed a routine over the past 4 days that included scanning the room for Sarah so he could continue his pattern of professional harassment. He believed he was dealing with a mid-level administrative officer who posed no threat to his status or authority. The morning session was scheduled to begin with remarks from the senior leadership of the conference, including what the agenda listed as comments from Admiral S. Mitchell, senior naval representative. Hartford had assumed this was a different person altogether, perhaps someone who would be participating via video conference or arriving later in the week. As officers filed into the main conference room, the usual informal seating arrangement began to sort itself out. However, instead of taking her customary seat toward the back, Sarah moved toward the front of the room where senior officers typically sat. The movement caught Hartford's attention, and he looked up from his conversation to see what he assumed was the lieutenant commander taking a seat far above her appropriate station. "Excuse me, Lieutenant Commander," Hartford called out loudly enough for much of the room to hear. "I think you're confused about where you should be sitting." Senior officers sit in the front rows. Every conversation stopped as officers turned to witness what they now understood would be a moment of profound embarrassment for Hartford. Sarah turned to face him, her expression calm but her bearing unmistakably authoritative. "Colonel Hartford," she replied in a clear, measured voice that carried easily across the quiet room, "I believe I am sitting exactly where I belong." Hartford, still oblivious to the situation, pressed forward. "Look, I know this is a big conference, and it might be exciting for administrative personnel to attend, but we need to maintain proper protocol here. Lieutenant commanders don't sit with the senior staff." Major General Thompson, the Army representative who served as conference co-chair, had just entered the room and immediately assessed the situation. He had worked with Admiral Mitchell on previous occasions and understood both her reputation and her actual rank. Seeing the tableau unfolding before him, he quickly moved to intervene before Hartford could dig himself any deeper. "Colonel Hartford, General Thompson said in a voice that cut through the tension like a blade. "I believe you may be confused about Admiral Mitchell's position at this conference." The word Admiral hung in the air like an explosive charge. Hartford's expression shifted from confidence to confusion as he processed what he had just heard. He looked again at Sarah, this time noticing details he had previously overlooked. The way other naval officers were standing when she entered, the respect evident in their bearing, and most importantly, the 4 stars clearly visible on her uniform. The realization hit Hartford like a physical blow. His face drained of color as the implications of the past 4 days crashed over him simultaneously. He had not just been disrespectful to a superior officer, he had been mocking and belittling one of the highest-ranking naval officers in the United States military. The lieutenant commander bars he had focused on for days had blinded him to every other indicator of Sarah's true authority and status. "Admiral," Hartford began, his voice suddenly hoarse and uncertain, but Sarah raised her hand gently to stop him. "Colonel, I think we should focus on beginning our session," she said diplomatically, though her tone carried unmistakable authority. "We have important work to accomplish today." The morning presentations proceeded, but the atmosphere in the room had fundamentally changed. Officers who had witnessed Hartford's behavior were struggling to focus on the strategic discussions, instead processing the extraordinary situation they had just witnessed. Hartford sat rigidly in his chair, his face still pale, occasionally glancing towards Sarah, as if trying to convince himself that what had just occurred was real. During the first break, Hartford approached Sarah with obvious reluctance. The confident, dismissive officer who had dominated conversations for 4 days had been replaced by someone clearly struggling with embarrassment and uncertainty about how to proceed. "Admiral Mitchell," he began quietly, ensuring their conversation would not be overheard. "I owe you an apology that I'm not sure I can adequately express." Sarah regarded him calmly, understanding that this moment was about more than just personal embarrassment. "Colonel, I appreciate your acknowledgement of the situation. However, I think this presents a learning opportunity for all of us about assumptions and professional respect." "I don't understand how I missed the signs," Hartford continued, his voice filled with genuine confusion and regret. "Your knowledge, your bearing, the way you carried yourself, it should have been obvious that you were far more experienced than your apparent rank indicated." "That's exactly the point, Colonel," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "Military courtesy and professional respect should not be dependent on rank alone. Every officer, regardless of their position in the hierarchy, deserves to be treated with basic dignity and to have their contributions evaluated on their merits." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of several other officers who had witnessed the morning's revelation. Commander Williams, who had suspected Sarah's true identity, offered his own apologies for not speaking up sooner. "Admiral, I should have said something when I began to suspect the situation, but I wasn't certain, and I didn't want to create an awkward situation. The entire situation has been a learning experience for everyone involved," Sarah replied diplomatically. "Perhaps we can use it to improve how we interact with each other going forward." As word of the morning's revelation spread throughout the conference, reactions varied significantly. Some officers expressed outrage at Hartford's behavior, viewing it as a serious breach of military courtesy that should have consequences. Others seemed more sympathetic, recognizing that the unusual circumstances of Sarah's incorrect uniform had created genuine confusion about her status. The afternoon sessions proceeded with a dramatically different dynamic. Hartford, clearly shaken by the morning's events, contributed little to the discussions and seemed to be struggling with how to interact with Sarah and others in light of what had transpired. His previous confidence and domineering presence had evaporated, replaced by uncertainty and obvious embarrassment. Sarah, for her part, participated fully in the discussions, offering insights and guidance that reflected her extensive experience and senior position. Her contributions were now received with the attention and respect they merited, and it became clear to everyone present just how much valuable input they had been dismissing over the previous 4 days. During the working group session focused on joint operations planning, Sarah shared detailed experiences from recent multinational exercises, providing insights that only someone with her level of responsibility and access could possess. The contrast with Hartford's dismissive comments about her supposed lack of real-world experience was stark and obvious to everyone present. That evening's social gathering at the officers' club was markedly different from previous nights. Hartford did not hold court with stories and opinions, instead spending much of the evening in quiet conversation with his aide and a few close associates. When he did interact with Sarah, it was with obvious deference and formality that bordered on awkwardness. Several officers approached Sarah throughout the evening to express their respect for how she had handled the situation. Captain Morrison, a Marine Corps officer who had witnessed some of Hartford's worst behavior, was particularly direct in his comments. "Admiral, I have to say that your restraint and professionalism over the past few days has been remarkable," Morrison said. "Many officers in your position would have shut down that behavior immediately, regardless of the circumstances. The situation provided valuable insights into how we interact with each other and what assumptions we make based on limited information," Sarah replied. "I think we've all learned something about the importance of treating everyone with respect, regardless of what we think we know about their background or experience." As the evening progressed, conversations began to focus on the broader implications of what had occurred. Several officers discussed how the incident had made them examine their own behavior and assumptions about junior personnel. Others talked about the importance of maintaining professional courtesy even when rank differences seemed to justify more casual treatment. Hartford spent most of the evening reflecting on his behavior and its implications for his career and reputation. He understood that word of his treatment of a four-star admiral would inevitably spread beyond the conference, potentially affecting his future assignments and advancement opportunities. More troubling to him personally was the recognition that his behavior had revealed character flaws and biases that he had never fully acknowledged or addressed. The evening concluded with the understanding that the final 2 days of the conference would proceed under dramatically different circumstances. The revelation of Sarah's true identity had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the gathering, creating opportunities for learning and growth while also highlighting the consequences of prejudice and assumptive thinking in professional military settings. As officers departed for their quarters, many carried with them new understanding about respect, assumption, and the complex dynamics of military hierarchy. The conference had become about much more than strategic planning. It had evolved into a powerful lesson about human nature, professional conduct, and the importance of maintaining dignity and courtesy, regardless of apparent rank or status differences. The sixth day of the conference began with an atmosphere thick with anticipation and unresolved tension. Admiral Sarah Mitchell arrived early to review her notes for the day's presentations, understanding that her role as senior naval representative now required her to address not just the strategic planning objectives, but also the leadership lessons that had emerged from the week's events. Colonel James Hartford had spent a sleepless night grappling with the full implications of his behavior. Beyond the immediate embarrassment of having publicly disrespected a four-star admiral, he faced the sobering reality that his actions had been witnessed by dozens of officers who would carry those observations throughout their careers. Military communities were small and interconnected. Stories of professional failures traveled quickly and were remembered for years. As officers gathered for the morning session, the changed dynamics were immediately apparent. Conversations that had flowed easily in previous days now carried undertones of tension and uncertainty. Hartford's supporters from earlier in the week maintained careful distance, while officers who had remained silent during his harassment of Sarah now offered respectful greetings and deferential attention to her comments. Major General Thompson opened the session by addressing the situation directly, understanding that attempting to ignore what had transpired would be both impossible and counterproductive. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone serious but measured, "yesterday's events have provided us with an unexpected but valuable learning opportunity about leadership, respect, and professional conduct. I believe we can use this experience to improve not just our strategic planning, but our understanding of effective military leadership." Sarah stood to address the group, her bearing reflecting the quiet authority that came with her rank and experience. "I want to thank everyone for their professionalism in handling what has been an unusual situation," she began. "While the circumstances that led to this week's events were unexpected, I believe they have highlighted important principles that apply to all levels of military leadership." She paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. "Military effectiveness depends not just on technical competence and strategic thinking, but on our ability to recognize and utilize the talents and experience of everyone in our organization. When we make assumptions based on limited information, when we dismiss contributions because they come from sources we consider unimportant, we weaken our entire enterprise." Hartford listened to these words with growing recognition of their personal relevance. His treatment of Sarah had been based entirely on his assumption that her apparent rank reflected her actual importance and experience. He had dismissed her contributions not because they lacked merit, but because he had decided in advance that someone of her supposed status could not possibly have valuable insights to offer. The morning's working sessions proceeded with a noticeably different tone from previous days. Sarah's contributions were now received with the attention they merited, and officers began to recognize how much valuable input they had been missing due to Hartford's influence and their own reluctance to challenge his dismissive attitude. The strategic planning discussions became more collaborative and productive as a result. During a break between sessions, Hartford made his second attempt to speak privately with Sarah. This conversation, unlike their previous exchange, reflected his deeper understanding of what had transpired and its implications. "Admiral," he began, his voice carrying genuine remorse, "I've spent the night thinking about my behavior this week, and I realize that a simple apology is inadequate for what occurred. I want you to know that I understand the seriousness of my actions and their reflection on my character and professionalism." Sarah studied him carefully before responding. "Colonel, I appreciate your recognition of the situation's seriousness, but I want you to understand that this isn't primarily about what you did to me personally. It's about what your behavior reveals about how we treat people when we think they lack the power or status to challenge us." "You're absolutely right," Hartford replied, his voice heavy with recognition. "I treated you dismissively because I thought I could do so without consequences. That says something disturbing about my character that goes far beyond this specific incident."
"The question now," Sarah continued, "is what you plan to do with this understanding going forward."
"Will this be a learning experience that changes how you interact with subordinates and colleagues, or will it simply be an embarrassing memory that you try to forget?" Hartford considered her words carefully. "Admiral, I want to ensure that this experience leads to meaningful change in how I approach leadership and professional relationships. I'm wondering if you might be willing to provide guidance on how I can use this situation to become a better officer and leader." The conversation marked a turning point not just for Hartford personally, but for the broader conference dynamics. Other officers who witnessed their respectful professional exchange began to understand that the incident could serve as a foundation for improved relationships and better leadership practices, rather than simply an embarrassing episode to be forgotten. The afternoon sessions focused on long-term strategic planning, areas where Sarah's experience proved invaluable. Her insights into future naval requirements based on her access to classified assessments and high-level strategic discussions provided context that significantly enhanced the quality of the planning outputs. Officers began to recognize how much they had lost during the previous days when her contributions were being dismissed or ignored. Captain Rodriguez, an Air Force officer who had remained largely neutral during the week's events, offered observations that resonated with many attendees. "This week has made me realize how often we probably miss valuable insights because we make assumptions about who has something important to contribute. I'm going to be much more careful about listening to everyone's input in the future." The comments sparked broader discussion about leadership practices and organizational culture. Several officers shared examples from their own experience, where assumptions about rank or background had led to missed opportunities or poor decisions. The conversation evolved into a productive examination of how military organizations could better utilize the talent and experience of all personnel, regardless of their apparent status or position. As the afternoon progressed, Hartford began to participate more actively in discussions, though with notably changed demeanor. Gone was the domineering confidence that had characterized his earlier behavior, replaced by careful attention to others' contributions and respectful engagement with differing viewpoints. His change in approach was obvious to everyone present and served as a practical demonstration of the leadership principles being discussed. During a working group session focused on joint operations coordination, Hartford found himself working directly with Sarah on developing recommendations for improved inter-service communication protocols. The collaboration provided an opportunity for him to observe her leadership style and strategic thinking firsthand, deepening his understanding of just how significantly he had misjudged her capabilities and experience. "Admiral," he said quietly during a brief pause in their work, "watching you lead this discussion has been enlightening. Your approach to building consensus while maintaining clear direction is something I need to learn from. Effective leadership often requires adapting our style to the situation and the people involved," Sarah replied. "What works in combat operations may not be appropriate for strategic planning sessions, and what's effective with experienced officers may not work with junior personnel." The final day of the conference began with presentations of the working group's recommendations. Sarah's role in coordinating and refining these outputs was now clearly visible to all attendees, and the quality of the strategic planning products reflected her contributions and leadership. Officers who had witnessed the week's events gained practical understanding of what they had missed when her input was being dismissed or minimized. Hartford's working group, which focused on land-sea coordination protocols, presented recommendations that reflected significant input from Sarah's naval expertise. In introducing the presentation, Hartford made a point of acknowledging her contributions explicitly, understanding that public recognition was an important element of demonstrating changed behavior and attitudes. "Our working group benefited significantly from Admiral Mitchell's extensive experience with joint operations," he told the assembled officers. "Her insights into naval requirements and capabilities were essential to developing realistic and effective coordination protocols." The acknowledgement was more than mere courtesy. It represented Hartford's recognition that effective leadership required giving credit where it was due and ensuring that contributions were recognized regardless of their source. Officers who had worked with both Hartford and Sarah during the week noticed the change in his approach and began to understand how the incident had affected his leadership style. The conference's closing session provided an opportunity for reflection on both the strategic planning objectives and the leadership lessons that had emerged. General Thompson addressed both aspects in his concluding remarks. "This week has been productive on multiple levels," he told the assembled officers. "We have developed strategic recommendations that will improve joint service cooperation and effectiveness. But perhaps more importantly, we have learned valuable lessons about leadership, respect, and the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of the circumstances." Sarah's closing remarks focused on the broader implications of the week's events for military leadership and organizational culture. Excellence in military operations requires not just technical competence and strategic thinking, but the ability to recognize and utilize talents wherever they exist in our organizations. When we allow assumptions, biases, or personal preferences to limit our willingness to listen and learn, we compromise our effectiveness and our professional standards. Her words carried special weight given the context of the week's events, and officers throughout the room recognized their relevance to their own leadership responsibilities and professional relationships. As the conference concluded and officers prepared to return to their assignments, many carried with them changed perspectives on leadership and professional conduct. The incident had served as a powerful reminder of the importance of treating all personnel with respect and dignity, regardless of apparent rank or status. Hartford faced a different kind of return journey. He understood that word of the week's events would inevitably reach his superiors and peers, requiring him to address questions about his conduct and judgment. More significantly, he faced the personal challenge of implementing the leadership changes he had committed to making as a result of his experience. 3 months later, Hartford's commanding officer noted marked improvements in his leadership style and interpersonal relationships. His willingness to listen to subordinates had increased noticeably, and his treatment of junior officers reflected new understanding of respect and professional courtesy. The embarrassing incident had evolved into a catalyst for meaningful professional growth. Sarah continued her distinguished career with the knowledge that her handling of an unusual and challenging situation had provided valuable lessons for dozens of officers who would carry those insights throughout their careers. The incident became a case study in military leadership courses, highlighting the importance of maintaining professional standards and treating all personnel with dignity regardless of circumstances. The story of the colonel who mocked an admiral became more than just a tale of embarrassment and recognition. It evolved into a powerful lesson about leadership, respect, and the way assumptions can blind us to the talents and experience of those around us. In military organizations where effectiveness often depends on the ability to quickly assess and utilize available resources, these lessons carried implications that extended far beyond a single conference room in Norfolk, Virginia. Years later, officers who had witnessed the events would share the story with their subordinates as a reminder of the importance of professional courtesy and the dangers of making assumptions based on limited information. The incident had demonstrated that true military leadership required not just technical competence and strategic thinking, but the wisdom to recognize that respect and dignity should never be dependent on rank or status.